There was a man sitting alone in the far corner of the dining hall, refusing to look up. Not a word. Not a nod. Not even a blink when Johnny Cash walked into Folsom Prison that cold January morning in 1968. The whole place was roaring with anticipation, 2,000 inmates packed shoulder to shoulder, guards nervous and sweating despite the chill, and then there was him. Row 17, seat 9, head down, arms crossed, stone silent. Cash saw him within the first 30 seconds of stepping onto that makeshift stage, and something about that stillness made the singer pause mid-stride. What happens when the one person who refuses to listen becomes the only person you can't stop watching? Folsom Prison had been waiting for Johnny Cash like a man waits for a pardon. The place had seen riots, stabbings, suicides, and more despair than any structure built by human hands ought to hold. It sat just outside Sacramento, a sprawling fortress of granite and iron that had swallowed men whole since 1880. By the time Cash arrived in January of 1968, Folsom was a name that carried weight in every courthouse and dive bar from California to Tennessee. The inmates knew his music the way drowning men know the surface of water. They had worn out copies of his records on contraband players, sung his lyrics in the yard when the guards weren't listening, carved his name into cell walls alongside the names of wives and mothers they would never see again. Cash had sung about trains and heartbreak and men who made bad choices, and every man behind those walls felt like he was singing directly to them. But there was one man who didn't. One man who sat in that crowd and refused to participate in the collective fever that gripped the room the moment Cash tuned his guitar. The concert had been fought for. It wasn't handed over on a silver platter by the California Department of Corrections. Cash had been pushing for it since 1966, after he played a smaller show at another facility, and felt something shift inside him. He told his producer Bob Johnston that he wanted to record a live album inside a Rio prison, not some polished studio with fake applause dubbed in later. He wanted the rawness, the danger, the unpredictability of men who had nothing left to lose. Johnston thought he was crazy. Columbia Records thought he was reckless. The prison officials thought he was naive. But Cash had a way of getting what he wanted, and by late 1967, the permits were signed, the equipment was loaded into trucks, and the date was set for January 13, 1968. 2 shows. Back to back. Morning and afternoon. The second show would be the one they recorded for the album, but the first show, the one that started at 9:30 in the morning, was where it happened. Where the silent man sat. Where Johnny Cash stopped everything. America in 1968 was a country coming apart at the seams. Martin Luther King Jr. would be dead in 3 months. Robert Kennedy in 5. The Tet Offensive had just shattered the illusion that the war in Vietnam was winnable, and every night the television brought the body count into living rooms across the nation. Young men were being drafted, cities were burning, and the old certainties that had held the country together since the end of World War II were crumbling like wet paper. Johnny Cash was 45 years old, standing at a crossroads in his own life. His first marriage had collapsed under the weight of pills and infidelity. He had been arrested multiple times, fired from the Grand Ole Opry, and written off by half of Nashville as a washed-up has-been who couldn't stay clean long enough to finish a recording session. But he had also met June Carter, and she had pulled him back from the edge in ways that nobody fully understood. By the time he walked into Folsom, he was sober, focused, and carrying a hunger to prove that he still mattered. That he could still speak to the forgotten men. That his voice could still cut through the noise. The inmates filed into the dining hall that morning with a kind of electric anticipation that the guards had never seen before. Men who normally shuffled through the routine of prison life with dead eyes were suddenly awake, alive, buzzing with an energy that made the officers tighten their grips on their batons. Security had been doubled. Every door was locked and checked twice. The warden had made it clear that if anything went wrong, the show would be shut down immediately, and Cash would never be allowed back inside a California prison for as long as he lived. But nothing went wrong. Not at first. The men sat down, row by row, and the room filled with the low hum of conversation, the scrape of metal chairs on concrete, the occasional shout of recognition when someone spotted a friend across the room. And then Cash walked in, dressed in black from head to toe, carrying his guitar like a weapon, and the place exploded. Men were on their feet, clapping, hollering, stomping so hard that dust rose from the floor. The guards stepped back instinctively, suddenly aware of how badly outnumbered they were. And Johnny Cash stood there, soaking it in, letting the noise wash over him, until he raised one hand and the room went silent. That was when he saw him. The man in row 17 who hadn't moved. Hadn't clapped. Hadn't even lifted his head. Nobody knows his name. Not for certain. The records from that day are incomplete, and the prison system didn't keep detailed logs of which inmates attended which events. Over the years, researchers have tried to piece it together, cross-referencing transfer records and disciplinary files, but nothing definitive has ever surfaced. Some say he was a lifer, a man who had been inside since the early 50s and had stopped caring about the outside world long before Cash ever picked up a guitar. Others say he was fresh off death row, spared by a last-minute appeal, sitting in that room because the guards thought it might do him some good to hear music one more time before they executed him anyway. A few old-timers who were there that day claim he was a child killer, and that the other inmates had already marked him for death, and that sitting in that concert was the closest thing to a funeral he would ever get. But nobody knows for sure. What is known is that Johnny Cash saw him, and something about that man's refusal to engage, that absolute stillness in a room full of chaos, got under his skin in a way that nothing else did. Cash opened with Folsom Prison Blues. Naturally. The song that had made him famous, the song that every man in that room knew by heart, the song about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die. The crowd went wild. Men were singing along, pounding on tables, laughing at the dark humor of it all. The band was tight. Luther Perkins on guitar, Marshall Grant on bass, W.S. Holland on drums, and they played with the kind of intensity that only comes from knowing you're standing on the edge of something dangerous and real. June Carter was there too, waiting backstage, watching her man command a room full of killers and thieves like he was born to do it. The energy was so thick you could taste it. And through it all, the man in row 17 sat motionless, eyes fixed on some point on the floor that only he could see. Cash finished the song, took a breath, looked out at the crowd, and then his eyes drifted back to that corner. He stared for a long moment, long enough that the band noticed, long enough that June noticed from offstage, long enough that the inmates started to shift uncomfortably in their seats because they could feel the tension building and they didn't know where it was coming from. Then Cash did something nobody expected. He stopped. Right in the middle of the set, right after the biggest applause of the morning, he stopped. He turned to the band and waved them off, told them to hold on a minute, and then he walked to the edge of the stage and pointed toward row 17. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant clang of a cell door somewhere deep in the prison, the nervous breathing of 2,000 men who suddenly had no idea what was about to happen. Cash didn't say anything at first. He just pointed. And slowly, every head in the room turned to look at the man he was pointing at. The silent man. The one who hadn't moved. The one who still wasn't moving. You, Cash said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You in the back. Why aren't you listening? The man didn't respond. Didn't even flinch. It was as if Johnny Cash wasn't speaking to him at all. As if the whole concert was happening in some other dimension that he had decided not to participate in. The guards tensed. A few of them started moving toward the row, thinking maybe there was a problem, maybe the guy was sick or having some kind of breakdown. But Cash raised his hand again and stopped them. He didn't want the guards involved. This was between him and the man in row 17. The inmates around the silent man were staring at him now, some with confusion, some with anger, some with a kind of pity that suggested they knew something the rest of the room didn't. One man leaned over and whispered something to him, but the silent man didn't react. Just sat there, locked in his own private hell, unreachable. Cash stood on that stage for what felt like an eternity, holding the room in his grip, refusing to move on until he got some kind of answer. And then, slowly, The silent man lifted his head. Not all the way. Just enough that you could see his eyes. They were empty. Not angry, not sad, not defiant, just empty, like somebody had scooped out everything inside him and left behind a shell. Cash looked at those eyes and something passed between them, some wordless understanding that nobody else in the room could access. And then Cash nodded once and turned back to the band. He didn't say another word about it. Just picked up where he left off, launched into Dark as a Dungeon. And the concert continued as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had happened. They just didn't know what. After the show, backstage, Cash was quiet. June asked him what that moment was about, why he stopped the whole concert for one man who clearly didn't want to be there. Cash didn't answer right away. He sat down on a crate, lit a cigarette, and stared at the wall for a long time. Finally, he said, "That man's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." June didn't press him. She had learned over the years that Johnny had a way of seeing things in people that others missed, a kind of dark intuition that came from spending so much of his life on the wrong side of the law himself. He understood what it meant to be lost. He understood what it meant to be beyond saving. And he understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a man like that is to acknowledge that he exists, even if he doesn't want you to. The second show that afternoon went off without a hitch. That was the one they recorded for the album, the one that would become one of the most iconic live records in the history of American music. Folsom Prison Blues, I Got Stripes, The Wall, Green Green Grass of Home. Every song hit like a freight train, and the inmates responded with the kind of raw, unfiltered emotion that you can't fake in a studio. The album was released in May of 1968 and shot to #1 on the country charts, crossed over to the pop charts, and turned Johnny Cash into a household name all over again. It saved his career. It redefined what a live album could be. It proved that there was still room in American culture for a man who sang about darkness and failure and the kind of redemption that doesn't come easy. But the man in row 17 wasn't at the second show. Nobody knows where he went. Some say he was pulled out by the guards and put back in solitary. Some say he refused to come back, that one show was all he could handle. Some say he died a few weeks later, though there's no record of it in the official logs. The mystery of that moment lingered. Over the years, people who were there that day, inmates, guards, even members of Cash's band, would bring it up in interviews, always with a kind of hesitation, as if they weren't sure they had the right to talk about it. Luther Perkins mentioned it once in a radio interview in 1971, just a few months before he died in a house fire. He said Cash never talked about it again after that day, but that he seemed different afterward, quieter, more reflective, like something about that silent man had shaken him in a way that even the worst days of his addiction never had. Marshall Grant, the bass player, wrote about it briefly in his memoir, describing the moment as the strangest thing I ever saw Johnny do, but offering no explanation for why Cash had stopped the show or what he thought he was accomplishing. June Carter Cash, in one of her last interviews before she died in 2003, was asked about Folsom and whether there were any moments from that day that stood out in her memory. She paused for a long time before answering, and then she said, "Johnny saw things in people. Things they didn't even see in themselves. And sometimes that was a gift, and sometimes it was a burden he carried alone." Folsom Prison itself became part of the mythology of American music after that concert. Tourists would drive out to see the place, though you couldn't get close without clearance. Writers and documentarians would request access to the archives, hoping to find some scrap of information that would explain what happened that morning in January of 1968. The California Department of Corrections eventually released some grainy black and white photographs from the event, and in one of them, if you look closely, you can see a figure in the back corner of the room, head down, isolated from the crowd. Whether that's the man Cash pointed at, nobody can say for sure. The image is too blurry, too distant. But it's there. A ghost in the frame. A reminder that not everyone in that room was saved by Johnny Cash's music. Some men were too far gone. The cultural impact of the Folsom concert can't be overstated. It arrived at a moment when America was desperate for something real, something that cut through the polished veneer of mainstream entertainment and spoke to the raw, unvarnished truth of what it meant to be human. Cash didn't sugarcoat prison life. He didn't pretend the men in that room were misunderstood angels. He sang to them as equals, as people who had made choices and were living with the consequences, and in doing so, he offered them something more valuable than sympathy. He offered them dignity. The album became a touchstone for the outlaw country movement, a blueprint for artists like Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson who wanted to push back against the slick, commercialized sound that Nashville was churning out in the late 60s. It also resonated with the counterculture, with young people who saw Cash as a rebel, a man who had walked through the fire and come out the other side still standing. But all of that, the cultural significance, the commercial success, the legend, was built on the foundation of that one morning and the silence of one man. Did Cash ever find out who he was? There's no evidence that he tried. No interviews where he mentions following up, no letters to the prison asking for information, no private investigations conducted on his behalf. It's possible he didn't want to know. It's possible that the mystery was more important than the answer, that the silent man represented something larger than himself, a symbol of all the people who couldn't be reached, who couldn't be saved, who existed in a place so dark that even Johnny Cash's voice couldn't penetrate it. Or maybe Cash understood that some questions don't have answers, and that the act of asking is more meaningful than any response you might receive. He spent the rest of his life singing to the forgotten, the broken, the lost. He recorded more prison albums, played more shows behind bars, advocated for prison reform in interviews and in his music. But he never talked about the man in row 17 again. The inmates who were there that day are mostly gone now. Folsom is still standing, though it's changed over the years, modernized in some ways, hardened in others. The dining hall where Cash played has been renovated twice, and there's a small plaque on the wall commemorating the concert, but it doesn't mention the silent man. Nobody thought to include him in the official history. He exists only in the margins, in the half-remembered stories of men who were there and the second-hand accounts of people who heard about it later. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some stories are meant to live in the shadows, whispered about but never fully explained, lingering in the back of your mind like a song you can't quite remember the words to. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, 4 months after June passed away. He was 71 years old, worn down by years of illness and heartbreak, but still carrying that same restless spirit that had driven him to walk into Folsom Prison in the first place. In his final years, he recorded a series of stripped-down albums with producer Rick Rubin, covering songs by everyone from Nine Inch Nails to Hank Williams, his voice reduced to a whisper but somehow more powerful than ever. He sang about death, about loss, about the end of the road, and he did it with the same unflinching honesty that had defined his entire career. And somewhere in those songs, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of that moment in Folsom, the weight of a silence that couldn't be broken, the ghost of a man who refused to be saved. There are moments in history that refuse to be fully understood, moments that resist explanation no matter how hard you try to pin them down. The silent man in row 17 is one of those moments. He exists now as a question without an answer, a detail in a larger story that refuses to resolve itself neatly. Was he a killer? A victim? A man who had lost everything and decided to stop pretending he cared? Did Johnny Cash see something in him that reminded him of himself, of the darkness he had fought so hard to escape? Or was it simpler than that, just two men looking at each other across a crowded room, recognizing in that brief instant that they were both carrying something too heavy to put down? There's no way to know. The records are incomplete. The witnesses are gone. The prison has moved on. But the story remains, passed down through the years like a folk song, changing slightly with each retelling, but never losing its essential shape. If you've stayed with me this far, you might be wondering why this matters. Why does one silent man in a room full of noise deserve this much attention? Why does a moment that lasted no more than a minute or two carry so much weight 5 decades later? The answer, I think, is that it reminds us of something we often forget, that not everyone gets saved. Not everyone finds redemption. Not everyone makes it to the other side of their darkness. Johnny Cash sang to thousands of inmates over the course of his life, and maybe he gave them hope, maybe he made them feel seen, maybe he even inspired some of them to turn their lives around. But he couldn't reach all of them. Some men were too far gone. And acknowledging that, staring directly at that reality without flinching or offering false comfort, is one of the bravest things an artist can do. Cash didn't look away from the silent man. He didn't pretend he wasn't there. He pointed at him, called attention to him, forced everyone in that room to confront the fact that not all suffering can be alleviated by a song. The Folsom Prison concert has been analyzed and dissected and celebrated for decades now, and it deserves every bit of praise it receives. It's a masterpiece of American music, a document of a time and a place and a cultural moment that can never be replicated. But it's also incomplete. The official version of the story, the one preserved on the album, the one that made Johnny Cash a legend, is missing something. It's missing the silence. It's missing the man who refused to participate. It's missing the darkness that couldn't be lifted. And maybe that's why the story keeps getting told. Because we know, on some level, that the real truth of that day isn't in the applause or the laughter or the triumph of a man reclaiming his career. It's in the corner of the room where one man sat alone, unmoved, unreachable, a reminder that some prisons don't have walls. There are still people who search for him. Music historians, true crime enthusiasts, people who became obsessed with the story and decided they needed to know who he was and what became of him. They file Freedom of Information Act requests with the California Department of Corrections, dig through old newspaper archives, track down relatives of inmates who were at Folsom in 1968. They compare notes on internet forums, build elaborate theories about his identity, argue over whether he was even real or just a story that got exaggerated over the years. But nothing ever comes of it. The man remains a ghost, a blank space in the historical record, a question mark at the center of one of the most famous concerts in American history. And maybe that's the point. Maybe he's not supposed to be found. Maybe his silence is the only answer we're ever going to get. Johnny Cash understood something about America that most people didn't want to acknowledge in 1968, and still don't want to acknowledge today, that this country was built on the backs of forgotten men, men who made mistakes or were born into bad circumstances or just ran out of luck, and that no amount of progress or prosperity could erase the fact that some people get left behind. He sang for them. He gave them a voice. But he also knew that singing wasn't enough. That music, no matter how powerful, couldn't fix everything. And on that January morning in Folsom Prison, he came face to face with the limits of what he could do. He stopped the concert. He pointed at the silent man, he tried to reach him, and he failed. And then he kept going. Because what else was there to do? The final song of the morning set was Greystone Chapel, written by Glenn Shirley, an inmate at Folsom who had sent Cash the lyrics a few weeks before the concert. Cash learned it overnight and performed it that morning, a gesture of respect and solidarity that moved everyone in the room to tears. It was a hymn, a plea for redemption, a recognition that even the worst men carry a spark of something holy inside them. And as Cash sang it, his voice cracking with emotion, the inmates swayed and hummed along, and for a few minutes, the dining hall of Folsom Prison felt like a church. But the man in row 17 didn't move. Didn't sing. Didn't cry. He sat there, locked in his silence, as unreachable as he had been from the start. And when the song ended and the applause erupted and Johnny Cash walked off the stage, that man stayed exactly where he was, a shadow in the back corner of a room full of light. So what happened next? Nothing. And everything. Nothing, because the man disappeared into the vast machinery of the prison system and was never seen or heard from again. Everything, because that moment became part of the legend, a piece of the story that refuses to die. A reminder that even Johnny Cash couldn't save everyone. The concert went on. The album was released. The world moved forward. But somewhere in the back of our collective memory, there's still a man sitting in row 17, head down, arms crossed, refusing to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most honest part of the whole story.